Let's say you want a cup of coffee. Coffee. But it just doesn't taste very good. So what do? Let's talk about it. The first thing that you should know is that this is normal. Everyone who starts making coffee at home runs into this problem at some point. At some point, your expectations are up here and the coffee you make ends up being, well, short of that. So please don't be discouraged. Secondly, the most important thing for you to do in this situation is not just to say my coffee is terrible, but to actually recognize what makes it terrible. And generally speaking, you might just hate the taste of coffee. I'm sorry, it was low-hanging fruit. But in all seriousness, the two basic flavors that you're going to be watching out for are bitterness and astringency, and on the other side of the spectrum, sourness, overwhelming and unpleasant acidity. Any good quality coffee that's been prepared properly should not fall into either edge of that spectrum. It should be in the middle with a little bit of bitterness and a bit of sourness. I mean, some of them can have a lot of sourness, but it's not the only flavor that you taste. And there's a big difference between that negative, disgusting, all you taste is acidity with no real body of flavor to it, versus a coffee that has a big presence of acidity but has been properly brewed and properly extracted. And that naturally segues into the heart of what I want to talk to you about today: extraction. Extraction is the word that we use to describe how much flavor have we, well, extracted out of our coffee beans. You see, the basic way you want to think about this is that when you start brewing coffee, you kind of go through this spectrum of flavor. At the beginning of your brewing process, and this is true across all different brewing methods, you start by extracting the really acidic, sour flavors that on their own are not all that pleasant. After you've done this, you start to extract what we might call the main body of flavor, the really good coffee flavor. This is the really enjoyable part that can be accentuated and made even better by the presence of a good acid flavor. But then after that, if you continue to extract, you're going to start extracting extreme bitterness and astringency. Now, it's not a word that we use all the time, but astringency is that flavor. It's kind of this weird drying sensation on your tongue. It's a naturally repulsive flavor to human beings. And if you extract too much material out of your coffee, in other words, if you use too long of a brew time, you'll get into that territory. And some bitterness, just like the acidity, can help that main body of flavor really pop. But you have to go through the acidic as well as the main body of flavor to get to that bitterness. Astringency is never good, and that is indicative that you have gone too long in your brewing time and extracted too much flavor. So what we want to do is go through the acidic portion, go through the core of our flavor and a little bit into that bitterness, and that's dependent on your own personal preference, and it also will vary on the beans that you use. But you never want to go all the way into that astringency because nobody likes that. And rather than enhancing the main body and the acidity, it will actually render all of those other flavors really unenjoyable. There's just no way around this. But let's talk about this in the context of the pour over that I just made. As a general rule, you want your brew time to run from about 2.5 to 3 minutes from start to finish when brewing with a Hario V60, and a Chemex is very similar. But the time is only a guide to get you in the ballpark of where you want to be. What you should do after you've brewed your coffee is taste it, but ask yourself, if you don't like it, is it too sour? Or is it too bitter? If it was too sour, you likely also had a short brew time, maybe even under 2 minutes. If it was too bitter, you probably had too long of a brew time, maybe even beyond 3.5 minutes. So what you do in this situation is you adjust your grind size, because your grind size in this case actually helps to control how fast the water flows through that coffee. And when you grind a little bit more coarsely, it will flow faster, reducing your brew time. If you grind a little bit more finely, it will slow down the flow of water and increase your brew time. But it's not just the time that you're changing. The more finely you grind the coffee, the less time it takes to actually extract that flavor. So a perfect example of this would be a French press compared to espresso. Those are on opposite ends of the spectrum in grind size. A French press uses a huge coarse grind size, and an espresso uses one of the finest grind settings out there. And when you compare the brew time 4 to 5 minutes for a French press versus 20 to 30 seconds for espresso, you can see that there's a direct correlation between how finely or how coarsely you grind your coffee and how long your brew time should be. In the case of the French press, because you have such a long brew time, your grind size can be very forgiving. But in the case of espresso, it is brutally demanding. You have to get your grind size exactly right or it's not going to taste very good. This is why any kind of coffee maker that uses that percolation style, meaning the water pours through the coffee, is so frustrating to get right. Because anytime you taste your coffee and you say, oh, it's too sour, let me grind more finely, you can end up exponentially changing your extraction, because when you grind more finely, you also are increasing the brew time, because anytime you reduce that particle size, you're shortening the necessary brew time, and you're also lengthening the actual brew time by slowing down the flow of water through that coffee. So we end up with a very basic principle. If your coffee is too sour, grind more finely. If your coffee is too bitter, or definitely if it's getting into being astringent, grind more coarsely. But let's say you brew your pour over, you hit that 2.5 minute window, so you know that you haven't over extracted or under extracted based off of the brew time, because you're in that window of where this brewer ought to work, but your coffee is still too bitter or too sour for your taste. What do you do then? Well, there's a couple quick things that you need to know that actually work in conjunction with each other, and that is your roast level and the temperature of your water. So basically, the darker your coffee has been roasted, the more easily it will give up flavor, and the hotter the temperature of your water, the more easily it will extract flavor. And so those two things can work together in conjunction to give you really good or really terrible results. So if you're using a really darkly roasted coffee with, let's say, boiling water, that 2.5 minute window might be a little bit too long of a brew time for that particular coffee. But instead of grinding more coarsely in that situation, knowing that you have a darkly roasted coffee, you can just reduce the temperature of your brewing water down to maybe 200 degrees. That won't extract quite as efficiently, and that will help to keep you from over extracting in that normal time window. Now you could just grind a little bit more coarsely and reduce your brew time, but it's not always a good idea to do that, because 2.5 minutes seems like a long time until you're actually doing it. And the shorter your brew window, the more precise you have to be on your grind size. Remember when we talked about espresso earlier? When you have a really short brew window, you really have to perfectly nail that grind size. And so trying to always hit that 2.5 to 3 minute window with a pour over is a really good idea to give yourself a little buffer, a little bit of insurance. And when you're over extracting in that time window due to a darkly roasted coffee, just lower the temperature of your water. Now you say, I don't have a kettle that's temperature adjustable. What do I do? Well, even if you're heating water in a pot on the stove, just stick a thermometer in it. That's a really inexpensive fix right there. Or I guess just don't buy that darkly roasted of coffee. The other side of things directly correlates. If your coffee is still sour and it's a very, very lightly roasted coffee, maybe try to up your brew temperature. Make sure that it's actually close to boiling when you go to brew to ensure that you get a proper extraction. Just remember that all of this takes a little bit of practice, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The only thing I didn't cover today is proportion. How much coffee to water should I be using? How strong or how weak should my coffee be? But that's a topic for another video, so I'll see you there.